Good afternoon and welcome to AXSChat. We're delighted to have Susanna Laurin from Funka with us today. Susanna is a returning guest, and obviously we're big fans of Funka, having spent time in Stockholm at the conference recently. Today we're going to be talking about European legislation and standards, and Susanna's been instrumental in doing some of the work on this and also explaining it, because actually that's what we invited you here for today, because we were all a bit sort of confused by what's what. So welcome, Susanna. It's great to have you back. Can you explain to us what's going on with the European Union, the Commission, the standards, the mandates, and everything else? Because it's all very interesting. It all sounds very good, but it's also a bit confusing for people that are easily confused like me.
So how many hours do I have to?
Half of one.
Okay.
Go.
But two things are happening more or less at the same time, and then a third thing is going on more or less in parallel. So I think this is why it's get difficult for people, because let's start with the two things that are actually happening, and then we can talk a little bit of what might be happening afterwards. So from the 1st of January 2017, we have a new procurement law in all the EU member states. And the new procurement law is based on a directive, which means that the European Commission has regulated how procurement is going to happen, and then it sort of trickles down to all the member states, and it becomes a national legislation in all member states. And as far as I know, all the member states have applied the new legislation on procurement at the latest on 1st of January 2017. Actually, the first deadline was April last year, but none of the countries where we work were finishing at that time. So, but from the 1st of January this year, we have a new procurement law. And there are many differences from the old law, but from an accessibility standpoint, the most important thing is that we move from that accessibility is something you should do or could do until something that you shall do, which means that we really go from a recommendation to requirement. And this is, of course, written a bit differently in the different languages because of the different member states, the national legislation. But all the laws that we have looked into actually translates from going from recommendation to requirement. And this is really a big shift, I would say. So, and the mandate that Neil mentioned was the mandate 376, and that was actually the way the EU works is that the Commission can decide that that's mandatory to have a certain standard on accessibility, and that all the member states should work in the same way, and all the legislation should be the same. That's what we call harmonized. So already in 2004, I think, there was a decision on this harmonized legislation or harmonized standardization of accessibility, but it took until 2008 before we started working on it. And then we worked for many years on this standard, and it wasn't until 2014 that the standard was actually released. And the standard that was the result of the mandate 376 is what is called the EN 301-549 standard. And that standard is what the procurement directive is actually pointing to. So in the legislation, it only says that it's required if the thing you are going to procure is going to be used by humans, which means it's not machine to machine, but the interface is actually going to be used by humans. Then you shall make requirements for accessibility. And then it doesn't say that you need to use the EN 301-549 standard, but that is the best standard we have. And it's a European standard, and it's being translated to more and more languages every day. And there is also a lot of learning material around the standard. And it's really a broad standard, not only covering the web, but the whole ICT spectrum. And it's a difficult standard. I know I have been one of the experts writing it. So if you think it's difficult to understand, you can blame me, partly at least. But as you know, a standard is not not always perfect because it's a compromise. A lot of different meanings and user organizations and industry and academy and public sector works together to get this standard. So of course it's a minimum standard, but it is the best one we have. And I think one of the most interesting thing with the EN standard is that it goes beyond the web and covers all ICT, and also that it's a combination of functional performance statements, which are very important for procurers to understand why they are actually posing these requirements, and also the technical functional requirements. So you can use the standard both to understand what kind of requirements you should pose and also to actually write your procurement. And in my mind, I really hope that this new procurement legislation in combination with the EN standard will make a big change in Europe. And why is that? I always get this question. Why do you think this legislation is going to work? Because there's not a policeman out there saying, did you follow these regulations or not? And it's, of course, true. There's no really built-in enforcement. But procurement people, they are usually legal people. And they work in departments that work a lot of with legal requirements in different kinds, and procurement is always based on a legal framework. So at least all the procurers that we talk to, all the procurers that we know in all our clients, they are actually, if there is a legislation on this and if there is a standard, they follow it. So it's very easy. These people do what you tell them to do. That's a very good thing with procurers. They are very well, now I'm generalizing of all procurers. Of course, they are just as individual and human as everyone else. But generally, they need regulation and they follow the rules. So that's the good thing with procurement. And I have seen already, and I just met with our friends in Holland, and I was also in Spain last week and talked to other colleagues. And it's very clear that we see already an increased interest from suppliers, general ICT suppliers, who had never before ever thought about accessibility. But now, since the procurement directive has been taken into force in the European member states, the demand for accessibility is rising because of the procurers using the standard as requirements. And we don't know that from just, reading all the procurements, because no one can do that. You would die from boredom. But what you do see, and not only us, but in different kinds, in Central Europe and in Southern Europe and in Northern Europe, where I'm based, we see a very clear trend of increased interest and increased demand from the suppliers that we have never heard of before. They have never, ever worked with accessibility. These are general ICT suppliers that want to sell to public sector. And they don't suddenly wake up in the morning and say, hey, let's be accessible. They do it only when the procurers require accessibility.
Right.
So I really think that I might be very naive, but I've been working with this for so long, and I sometimes think we are not moving forward and nothing is happening, and why are we working so hard, and why can we never sort of make this going? But I really do believe that this procurement directive can make a big change. It won't happen overnight, I know. It needs to be known, people need to be trained, and there's a lot of things happening. But really, if we can solve accessibility on the procurement side, then I think we do a lot of good things. So that is one thing happening, and that is already happening right now in Europe. And then, so in my mind, this is the most important thing. But the thing people talk mostly about is the Web Accessibility Directive. So this is a much smaller and or narrower legislation. It's the same thing. The European Commission decides on a directive, and a directive in EU language means legislation. So it's legislations that is going to be put, the impact will be made on a national level. So the EU decides what to do, but then the member states need to actually implement the national legislation. And the Web Accessibility Directive was decided in December last year. And now we are under something called transposition. And transposition means that it's the period under which the member states can take this directive from the EU and make it into national legislation. And on the 23rd of September of next year, 23rd of September 2018, every member state must have a national legislation complying to the Web Accessibility Directive. So from December last year until September next year, everyone is working like maniacs to make their new legislation adhere to the, or align to the directive made by the European Commission. And the Web Accessibility Directive, that only covers, of course, the web, but also apps, which is new. And it's also a little bit blurred about intranets, but something about the intranets is also there. But websites and apps, absolutely, and then intranets. Also, documents are covered, but it's only public sector. So this is not a general Web Accessibility Directive for all websites in Europe. It is only the public sector websites. But according to the European Commission, there is 710,000 public sector websites in Europe. So there's a lot of websites. And I don't know how many apps, but all these public sector bodies, of course, they have at least one website. Most of them have more than one. And all of this is covered by the directive. In the Web Accessibility Directive, the regulation they point to is actually not WCAG, which you would think, but they point to the EN 301-549 standard. So it's the same minimum requirements as it is in the procurement directive. That's clever. But if you look closer to the EN 301-549 standard, you see that that is a lot of ICT around that doesn't have anything to do with the web. But Chapter 9 in the standard, that equals WCAG 2.0. So even if the Web Accessibility Directive points to the EN standard, in reality, it points to WCAG 2.0. It's a bit difficult for the member states right now to understand. For example, there's something called the gray zone. I mean, if you have the tax authority, it's kind of simple, easy to understand that that is a public sector body. But in many member states, some very important public services are performed by foundations or private companies. And are they covered or are they not covered? That's a little bit difficult for the member states to understand. So during this transposition period, there is something called the Web Accessibility Directive Expert Group, who is meeting together with the Commission on a regular basis. And they have appointed 7 experts. I am one of the experts, and then I have 6 colleagues from different parts of the community in Europe to help the Commission and the member states to overcome these problems and discussions and unclarities in the directive. Also, we need to make clear how are we going to make sure that the right thing is actually measured. The directive means that you need to comply with WCAG, but when we talked about apps, what are we supposed to measure against? I mean, you can use some of the things in WCAG also for apps, but it doesn't cover touch. So what are you going to do? That's a problem that we are now trying to solve in the Web Accessibility Expert Group. And we haven't got the solution yet, I can tell you, but we're still discussing it. And the other thing we are going to try to make recommendations around is what is called the Web Accessibility Statement. So all the public sector websites, they do not only need to comply, but they also need to report. They have to have an accessibility statement on how to, I mean, if a part of their service is not accessible when the directive enters into force, how can I do if I need the information in another format, or how can I complain, or what kind of plans do you have for the future? Something like that needs to be very clear on the website. So the statement is also something that is going to be decided. Exactly how it's going to be stated is decided in the Web Accessibility Expert Group. And the third thing
Deborah has to jump off shortly. So I know you.
Yeah, sorry, I have a conflict, so I just want to make a couple of very quick comments. I agree with what you're saying, Susanna. The progress that I'm seeing made globally, it's not where I would like it to be. I also want to compliment the work that you are doing in Europe, because what we found in the United States and also other countries, but just looking at it from the US lens, is that unless we get procurement involved, made. When it starts being involved, I remember years ago, I had a corporation come to me and say, IBM is saying that we have to make things Section 508 compliant. How can they ask that? They're not government. And I said, is it their procurement? Yes. Well, they can do whatever they want with your procurement. You don't have to bid on it. So I agree with you. And I think that the US, I think we're looking at what you are doing in Europe, because we actually think you're going to get a better grasp on things. We're still a little bit too vague. We're suing each other in the US, but I don't see some of the grounding that we see happening in Europe. So I want to applaud all of you, Europeans and the UK, for the efforts that you're making, because I think it's going to change everything. So thank you. Or let me jump in for a few minutes, and I'm going to,
okay.
I applaud the work you are doing. Thank you.
And we're still European for now, by the way.
Yes, I heard that, Europe and UK.
I'm in denial about Brexit, so.
We're all in denial. But the third thing we are going to try to solve during the Web Accessibility Directive expert, the WCAG discussions, is how to monitor the Web Accessibility Directive. Funka and W3C and Empirica and COE made a study a couple of years ago with recommendations for the monitoring methodology, but that was really not, the study was made looking into what is going on in the different member states today. So the Commission wanted to know, is there something out there that we can use? And that we did validate different methods and so on, and we tested automatic tools and we tested other methodologies, and the conclusion was that nothing is really perfect yet. No one has sort of solved the problem yet, so we need to come up with something better. And then we made a couple of recommendations. And now what is happening in the Web Accessibility Directive expert group is that we are discussing, is there some sort of common ground or something? Can we come forward with a recommendation that ends up in what kind of data do you actually need to come up with, but maybe not the exact way of doing it. Maybe countries can do it a little bit different and still get the same results, so to speak, because I think it's very difficult because the different member states are they have different matureness in accessibility. And the worst thing that could happen with the directive is that we try to align and the bottom line gets so low so that the more advanced countries, so to speak, when it comes to accessibility, they actually move backwards. That wouldn't be a good thing. So we need to help the not so well-performing countries to perform better, but also still pushing the higher ranking ones up. So that is what we are really trying to achieve in the expert group. But in September next year, the new legislation on a national level needs to be in place. But then you have the public sector website they have 1 year to make their new websites work or comply. They have 2 years for their existing systems if they don't do updates, and they have 33 months for some reason. Of course, 1 year, 2 year, and 33 months. That's EU logic. Couldn't be 3 years, could it? For making their apps comply. So there's a long period of time, and then the monitoring will be made with a methodology that the European Commission decides. So all the European member states are going to comply to the same rules, and they're also going to be monitored the same way and everything. So you will have a possibility to compare how different sectors and different regions and different countries perform, which will be the first time you have that kind of statistics going on at the same time. So these two things are the ones that are decided, and this is happening now. And then the third thing that tends to get a bit blurred when people mix it all up is the European Accessibility Act. That is only that is not a decision. It's just something that is discussed now, and it would be a broader legislation if it comes true. It will be also covering private sector and also products and things. So that will be a much broader legislation. But until now, no decision has been made, and I don't know if this will ever be a legislation or not. So let's stick to the Procurement Directive and the Web Accessibility Directive, because that is happening. That is already decided, and then there's a lot of other things going on. But the interesting thing now is that the countries that did not have a Web Accessibility legislation before, they need to get one. And the countries that had legislation before, they need to align their legislation to sort of harmonize with EU legislation.
So we see different countries in Europe now. If we look to different reports from the United Nations in relation to digital service in government, we see a huge gap all over Europe. We see countries like UK or Estonia who are really ahead in the way how they think digital for citizens. And then there are other countries where they basically do is they bring their, let's say, a mindset, they try to bring to digital the mindset about what they were doing before digital. So when you are experiencing or engaging with government, you are not actually having a digital experience, you are just having the experience that you used to have in paper, bringing into digital. So how do you see, now we have procurement and we have the web accessibility regulations coming. How do you see this fitting in so diverse Europe in terms of how they do these services for citizens? Do you think it will be a way for countries to start doing digital in a different way, or you realize that some countries might need help and support to be able to implement this from a cultural level in their in government?
I wish I could say that the accessibility requirements will solve all problems, but I don't think so. I think some countries are really struggling with sort of the E in e-governance, and they need help to get going with the digital transformation at all, to make a real, I mean, they say that's e-services, but it's just a PDF that you need to print and send out with snail mail. So I mean, it's nothing e with it. You just put it on the website. So I completely agree with you, and that is of course also less, even less accessible to most people. So it's a combination of problems there. But I think the best thing that the directive can do is to put focus on accessibility in the countries where we are mature in ICT generally, and where there are digital services, and to make them higher quality, and to try to make it sort of mandatory to not publish things before you test it, and so on. So that could be a good thing. Unfortunately, I don't really think that this directive will help so much for the countries that are very, very far away from being accessible, because it's so much more money needed and so much more, well, it's a mindset more or less from how do you work with digital services, and you need that transformation to happen. And if we can be there and sort of stick accessibility to it in the process, then I think that will really help. So hopefully when they start moving, they will take broader leaps and they will take bigger steps forward, so they don't need to make the same mistakes as we maybe did before. But I have problems seeing that neither the procurement directive nor the web accessibility directive would really make that shift happen. I think it needs to be, there's many things usually happening. It's a cultural thing, it's a money thing, and it's the whole contextual thing, all the infrastructure around, and it takes time to change that in societies that are still very, very much on paper. But when it starts happening, it usually goes quite quick.
Yeah.
The good thing is that today, when you procure something or you buy a new system or e-services for digital services, they are generally less inaccessible. I wouldn't say they are perfect, but they are much less inaccessible than when they were when Sweden, for example, started maybe 10 years ago. So the countries that move now to e-services, they will get a head start. So hopefully it will go faster for them.
I think also organizations like GDS have open sourced a lot of the stuff that they do.
Yeah.
So if countries want to take on digital transformation, and we talked about cost, but one of the key drivers for the UK to do the transformation in the first place was actually reducing cost. there is a methodology already there, pretty much available for people to lift and shift. So if you look at what the New Zealand government did, they actually took all of the code from gov.uk and rebranded it for New Zealand government. So I think that there is an opportunity for people to build on the back of what's already been done.
Absolutely.
I think it's great to see the legislation. I'm concerned that actually there's a wider world out there than the government, and that's something that we really still need to address. But it's much harder to police. So what appetite do you think there is to go beyond? Because I know that Norway's gone beyond, and they're requiring everyone to do this. But it's easier to police, sites in the Norwegian language. There aren't so many of them than it is to police, maybe sites in English where there's a huge proliferation. So, what kind of appetite do you see within the EU, and obviously whether UK goes separate way or not? What impact do you think it would have if there was to be direction?
Well, on the EU level, there is an appetite, definitely. I mean, the European Accessibility Act is really aiming for that, and there are, well, it depends on who you ask, of course, and it depends on what level. I mean, if it's the Parliament or the Council and so on. But there's definitely smart people working on it and really trying to pushing it. So yes, there is an appetite. I see less of an appetite in that direction from the national governments. We work with 8 or 9. We have specific contracts and assignment for some other member states that we help in the transposition. And I must say that they are trying to, take out as much as possible. They're trying to make it minimum. That's a problem always when you start talking about legislation. They say, how much do we actually have to do? So even in the countries where we nowadays do more, I mean, in Scandinavia, most of the requirements are much higher than just WCAG. But now we see that WCAG is being the minimum again. And I just learned from Holland that's the same there. I mean, the Dutch government had a broader perspective than WCAG before, but now they skipped everything that's outside of WCAG and that's moved. So actually, nations are moving backwards. So legislation is really problematic in that respect. So that's one part of it. But again, the procurement directive, the idea is that you can only legislate public sector procurement. But when the suppliers that want to sell to government, when they actually understand how to make their products and services accessible, the sort of further logic is that it will spread through them, because they would be, I mean, if ATOS has one system that is accessible that you can sell to governments, would you then keep another version that is inaccessible just to sell to the others? I mean, that would be stupid. You would do just one system and have it in an accessible format. So that is the idea, the sort of hidden agenda, or not so hidden, but really the idea behind it is that the suppliers will learn, because almost all of them wants to sell to public sector. Or at least all the bigger ones. So, and that when they sort of when the demand turns to them and they need to be able to produce things that are accessible, then that will also spread. So that's the sort of logic behind it, because the Commission cannot, or hasn't been able to yet, at least, to cover also the private sector websites. But of course, if you talk about from an end user perspective, I would like to start with completely different websites, because I mean, why do we always say the most important thing in life is to pay taxes? I mean, to me, it's not. No. I would prefer to go to the cinemas or be able to buy a book, or, I mean, there's a lot of other websites that are more important in my life than the tax authorities' websites. So absolutely, I mean, I really hope that we will broaden this. But I also see, at least in the markets where we work, that like bigger banks, they do take the responsibility, even if they don't have to, but they look very closely into the Web Accessibility Directive and they want to be as good as the big. So no, I think
that's something we're seeing too.
Some media company, I mean, some of the bigger corporations will also try to be good guys and follow the regulations, even if they don't have to.
No,
yeah.
so
So what I was going to say was that the banks for sure are doing it, and if you look to Barclays, they've definitely made the calculation that their customer base is older and therefore more likely to have disabilities, and therefore they're following the money. And we see other banks doing it too. Antonio, I cut across you, so if you want to get in the last point before we close, because we're pretty much on the half hour, that's fine.
No, we observe that in other situations, the European Union has put together a roadmap where you are able to find events happening in different countries, where somehow people have support in order to implement some of the initiatives. Is this part of this roadmap for accessibility? Is this something that the European Union is also planning to create work groups on different countries where people can have support in relation to the implementation of accessibility?
There is a requirement in the Web Accessibility Directive that each member state should have what they call an observatory. So somebody's going to a public sector, or it could be a non-government organization, or I mean, you can choose whatever organization, but there should be a body, an observatory that takes care of the monitoring and also provides information and support to the public sector agencies, at least. I don't know if you're also required to support the suppliers, but you are required to give support to the public sector website that are covered under the under this. So, but one of our actually good question. One of our recommendations in our study was that there would be a European-wide sort of competence center to do this, because it seems to us to be very expensive to build the same structure 28 times. So as a taxpayer, I would prefer that it was centralized, or at least that someone was taking care of this kind of push or pull, whatever you call it. The training and things like that would be, it would be very good if it was also taken care of centrally, I think. But then, of course, you also need to translate it in different countries and so different languages. But
That sounds really great. So thank you very much for your time today. It's been really informative. We look forward to chatting with you tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.